Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Council of the Americas for our program today on Russia in the Americas. What is happening and what can we expect? My name is Eric Farnsworth. I run the Washington office of the Council, and I'm delighted to be your host today for what promises to be a fascinating conversation with some true experts in the field to help us understand and think through what is going on and what's at stake. We're all very aware of the news of the day. That mere days ago, Russia attacked a peaceful democratic neighbor, Ukraine, and the war is heating up and intensifying even as we speak, with casualties on both sides. We also know that the world has taken notice, and much of the world has condemned this bald-faced aggression. At the same time, Latin America has taken a somewhat different approach at times, and in fact, one of the more interesting details of the entire tragedy at this point to note, at least from the diplomatic perspective, is Latin America's reaction, which has been, in a word, mixed. Rather than full-throated rejection of the violation of a peaceful democratic neighbor by an expansionist authoritarian dictatorship, much of the region has taken a more neutral position. In the run-up to hostilities, the presidents of Argentina and Brazil traveled to Moscow, reportedly against the expressed wishes of Washington and others, to promote stronger relations with President Putin's regime. At the United Nations, Latin American and Caribbean nations have largely supported the call for a cessation of hostilities, of course. Nonetheless, several have couched their views in a more balanced manner, purporting to understand Moscow's regional security requirements in a sort of moral equivalency with Western Europe and NATO, despite the unilateral, unprovoked attack by Russian forces. Of course, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, Latin America's own three dictatorships, have all offered strong rhetorical support for Russia. Venezuela's support at the United Nations remained unrecorded, however, because Caracas has lost its vote due to non-payment of dues. The other two abstained, but have clearly aligned with Moscow more broadly. All of which begs the broader questions of what's in it for Latin America and the Caribbean, and why? And as we seek to understand the regional response to the attack on Ukraine, it's also helpful to investigate Russian activities across the region more broadly, which have been ongoing for some time. From legitimate commerce to security cooperation to media manipulation, political accommodation, and the undermining of democracy, Moscow continues to be actively engaged. Today, with an expert panel, we want to explore these issues. And so we are joined by Guillermo Solis, the former president of Costa Rica and a personal friend, if I can say, Mr. President.
Absolutely.
To be able to say that. Who is now the interim director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at Florida International University in Miami. We're also joined by Doug Farah, the president of IBI Consultants, who is also a senior visiting fellow at the National Defense University Institute for National Strategic Studies, also a personal friend. Doug, welcome to you as well. And Dr. David Kramer, yes, a personal friend, who is the managing director for global policy at the George W. Bush Institute. And David is also a senior fellow, along with President Solis at the Green Center. And together they've just written a very interesting piece on these topics that we're discussing today in the Miami Herald, and I call that to everyone's attention. And it should be, if everything is going according to plan, on our website for you to pull down and have a look at, in addition to other materials, including the biographic information of all of our three panelists today. So we welcome all of them, and we look forward to our pending conversation. So let's begin, Mr. President. Get us going. Are you surprised at all by the response to the invasion of Ukraine by much of Latin America, and what might we be able to expect going forward?
Well, thank you very much, Eric. Thank you for this program, for organizing it, putting it together, and absolutely, and have been friends for a long, long time, so I guess that denomination is quite correct. My perspective maybe is a little more nuanced than yours in the sense that I think that overall, most countries have rejected very strongly, most Latin American countries have rejected, and Caribbean countries have rejected very strongly the invasion. And their expressions, not of support, but of quote unquote understanding, as you have so correctly pointed at, are more, I think, part of a larger perspective of the countries trying to keep all their options open at this point. But if you look at the statements and with some exceptions, yes, they are condemning at the United Nations, but then the heads of states and presidents are coming out and saying or presenting a different opinion before the media. Um, there is, I think, a very solid regional understanding that this has been an invasion, full-fledged invasion from a dictatorial regime upon a country that did not do anything to deserve that invasion. And in my perspective, this is going to be the situation going forward. Obviously, the dictatorships in the hemisphere, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, will continue to support it. But even Nicaragua had to abstain. I mean, this has been so outrageous. And the conditions in the terrain in Ukraine are so devastating in terms of human and material costs that it's very difficult to take a different position. Now, obviously, for most Latin American countries, if not all of them, even those who are allies of Putin, the truth of the matter is that Russia is not a strategic partner. And therefore, putting themselves in a situation of having to explain too much about their behavior is something that's not to the advantage of anybody. But I think that as time goes on and we see the atrocities that are being committed in Ukraine, the position of most countries, democratic countries, the vast majority of Latin American countries, is going to continue showing its solidarity to President Zelensky's government and to the people of Ukraine more generally.
And that's exactly why we wanted to launch the conversation with yourself, to add some perspective into the conversation and to really build nuance in. I was trying to be intentionally provocative at the beginning, and you rightly saw through that. So thank you for getting us going in such an effective manner. And David, let's go to you. You're a real Russia expert, and you've studied the issues in terms of Russia and emerging markets, et cetera. What do you think President Putin is looking for at this stage, if anything, from Latin America in the context of Ukraine? Is he pleased with what he's seen? Is he disappointed? Does he care?
Of the 5 countries that voted against the UN resolution, none of them came from Latin America. And I think that's noteworthy. Even countries that rely on Putin for support did not vote against the resolution. They abstained. So Putin has been looking at Latin America as a region where he can try to damage American interest and credibility. It is as much trying to increase Russian influence in the region as it is to try to ruin America's reputation in the region. And so Putin has tried this through military support to various regimes in the region. He has tried it through political and economic support, although Russia, of course, does not have the same kind of budget available for these activities as China does. He's done it through the Sputnik diplomacy, which is the vaccine diplomacy, although not many countries have been interested in receiving it, although Argentine President Fernandez did thank Russia for its vaccine support when he visited in early February. And they do it through, I think, very reckless and dangerous propaganda that is done through RT in Spanish, as well as Sputnik. There's a Sputnik vaccine. There's also a Sputnik propaganda outlet that the Russians use. And so Putin views this as a way to return the favor, if you will, to the United States. He thinks that we have been meddling and interfering in his sphere of influence, what he views as Russia's sphere of influence, which would be countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and others. And he feels that he's going to return the favor by doing the same to us, meddling in countries in what he thinks is our sphere of influence, when in fact, of course, we're talking about countries that are fully independent. And so for Putin, he views things in zero-sum terms. What is good for the United States is bad for Russia and vice versa. And so what he wants to do is to try to play in this region by damaging the United States. There was talk in the middle of January that Russian officials might consider military deployments to the region as negotiations were underway to try to prevent the war from breaking out with Ukraine. I'm not sure how seriously to take that, although there have been military deliveries to countries like Venezuela in the past. and he reestablished ties with Nicaragua's Ortega fairly recently. And of course, as President Solis mentioned, we've had the 2 visits to Moscow in the past month or so by the presidents of Argentina and Brazil. And for Putin, that is worth quite a bit as he tries to lure countries away from what he views as America's sphere of influence. I do think that the way the war is playing out in Ukraine, it is just war crimes before our eyes, crimes against humanity before our eyes, as we see Russian forces use indiscriminate bombing against civilian targets. And who knows what else Putin might resort to, since the campaign has not gone terribly well from Russia's perspective. I do think that more countries will be turned off by the way Putin and Russian forces are conducting this operation. And on top of it, I would just add, Eric, that there are many rumors going around that tomorrow Putin is likely to impose martial law in Russia. And if that's the case, I think any president who was thinking of a visit to Moscow better think twice. And I think those who did pay visits to Moscow should really be ashamed of themselves.
Yeah, thanks for those excellent comments. And, as you're talking, I'm thinking, well, there are huge implications here for the region, not just in the context of, war crimes and, basic humanitarian instinct, but, as sanctions really begin to bite, supply chains are really begin to be impacted, inflation kicks up because of energy prices and things like this. Latin America and the Caribbean are really going to be impacted. I want to come back to that topic in a specific way, but before we do, Doug, let's come to you, Doug Farah. Let's pick up on what Dr. Kramer was just talking about in the context. I mean, this isn't new for Russia, right? They've had some very long and deep engagement in the region, and it seems to be with a desire to disrupt things. No, I mean, it's hard to get a strategic direction here other than just to kind of be a disruptor. Am I wrong on that? You've studied this a lot. What's your view on that?
Well, thank you, Eric, for the chance to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to share with such a distinguished panel here. As was said, I think what we have understood from our looking at what they've been doing in the region is, unlike China, which deals with everyone and has a lot of resources, Russia has very specific and very deep relationships with a few people across the region. Daniel Ortega being, I think, probably in many ways the most important because of his longstanding relationship. You have obviously Nicolas Maduro. You have the new abstainer in the region in the Bukele administration in El Salvador, which did not vote to condemn in the United Nations, which was an interesting choice by him. But what we've seen across the region is a series of efforts to shape particularly the information environment. And as was said, that they view Latin America as our near abroad, Russia does, and they view us as being in their near abroad. And so the attempt to be here to show that they can meddle in what they view as the U.S. sphere of influence, I think is very important. And we see this in their very deep relationship with Daniel Ortega, where they have huge information and cyber capabilities being developed in Nicaragua, where they're able to project massive amounts of disinformation into Latin America. The country that's surprising to us in our research over the years, that it's central to this, not ideologically, but because of its infrastructure and ability to stay out of the limelight, is Chile, where the Russians have multiple front organizations, all run by former KGB senior officials, where RT Español is based, where Sputnik is based. And what we've mapped out in the series of studies that we've published is there are a series of particular individuals who will do a report for RT TV in Español. Then they'll do the exact same report for Ispan TV, which is the Iranian television station. And then they'll do the exact same report for Telesur, which is the Bolivarian Venezuelan station. So you see the same, what we call super spreaders in these events, pushing the same message on multiple different platforms across the hemisphere. And some of them change. There's one particular Chilean journalist who also speaks Arabic, and so he's able to take his message, shape it for different audiences, and push it out there. And we've seen the overlap of this particular network with groups out of Spain that support the Bolivarian Revolution, but also have a significant media capacity. So we see them shaping the environment, the media and information environment very heavily, and that seems to be one of their primary areas. If you look at Nicaragua specifically, they also have their security training school, which has trained very few people, but has given them a permanent base with the same commander over the last 7 years, where they've developed significant understandings of both what the U.S. is trying to do in the region and presenting themselves constantly as an alternative in areas where they know the United States is interested. So they focus their supposed training and their rhetoric on the work of the cocaine interdiction. They can offer separate technologies, etc. What's little understood is that for the last multiple years, there's been an average of 350 Russian military advisors on the ground in Nicaragua every day. And that's not something, and if you map that with what the US presence in Nicaragua has been after about 2011, it drops down pretty much to zero. So they've been maintaining this persistent presence there where they've been able to build out multiple other capabilities. And I'll finish by saying the people that we've identified as the leaders in the Russian front companies and organizations in South America that also operate in Nicaragua and elsewhere is that they all come from the cryptology, heavy cryptology backgrounds. They're all deeply involved in cyber activities. One of the people, who's a retired KGB general in Chile, actually has a contract which we found in Russian, where he was awarded multiple billions of dollars in 2008 to provide cybersecurity to the Russian state. He's not your average businessman wandering around Latin America, trying to get people to go to invest in Russia as he portrays himself. So I think there are multiple aspects to it, but the disruption, I think, is central. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. And let's go back to President Solis. Doug Farah has just been talking about, in addition to a number of other things, the Russian efforts to mold the public opinion space, right? The political space, the environment within which some of these things occur. As a former president of Costa Rica, obviously a neighbor of Nicaragua, which seems to have a very strong relationship with Russia, as has just been described. How did you see this play out in the day-to-day? Did it have any impact at all from your perspective in Costa Rica? Let me ask it a different way. Are people really attracted to this message? Or do they kind of see it as, there they go again, this is Russia today, and there's not much of an audience? How does that play out from the perspective of somebody who's literally sat next door to a country that some would say is a client state, but at least an ally of Russia, in a democracy, all of these things? How did you see those issues, Mr. President?
Well, actually, Eric, my bigger concern when I was in office was not RT, but rather the rearmament of Nicaragua. They completely refurbished their armed forces. The conflict hypothesis has never been with Costa Rica. I mean, that's not the point. They are thinking in Colombia more than us. But the fact that they have that they provided Nicaragua with tanks, T-50 tanks, T-72B1, and then I have a list of other armaments here that I don't have in English, but that includes missiles, includes anti-aircraft defense, 4 missile boats, vehículos blindados, Tiger. They have even aircraft. They have done this, through in 2014 and 2015, and there is the satellite issue that Doug has indicated, the facilities, and those are the things that really concerned us. So much so that in 2 of my speeches at the United Nations, I called the attention to this process. And it didn't create seemingly any difficulties, or it was not a source of concern for the Obama administration at the time, and later to the Trump administration either. So maybe this is because in the overall, analysis of things, Russia is not a threat. It's not a real threat, and it's a nuisance, and yes, we are seeing, as David so correctly pointed at, a Monroe Doctrine on the reverse kind of thing, But the truth of the matter is that the messages that RT, going back to the RT question, and the more sophisticated soft diplomacy kind of things, their programs are pretty good in terms of the quality of the programs, of the people they interview. They have analysts as legitimate as any other analysts that you can portray in the region, and that creates at least confusion, if not endorsement, from citizens. Now in Costa Rica, that's not the case again because we have lots of sources, and because our relationship with Nicaragua, difficult as it is, fortunately has been alleviated by the resolutions of the International Court of Justice regarding the border. So, we are unlikely victims of a Nicaragua aggression at this time, although seeing Putin, if they follow Putin's counsel, they could probably get us sometime. But that's not the real question. But clearly, there has been in Nicaragua a strong foothold for them, and that's not going away, as Doug so correctly pointed out.
And I think, you're exactly right. Nobody's suggesting that Nicaraguan, at least today, is going to invade Costa Rica. But let me ask this question, then let me follow up, Mr. President, and then we'll go back to Dave Kramer. The question being, A, what do they need any of these weapons for and armaments? And B, how are they paying for them? I mean, Nicaragua is a country that is destitute in terms of poverty, one of the poorest, if not the poorest, with Haiti of the entire Western Hemisphere. And, weapons don't come cheap, especially advanced weapon systems. Help us think through that understanding. I mean, is this just simply Russian largesse and they say, here are some weapons? Presumably they want to get paid for them. How does that occur? Any thoughts on that?
Well, they're loaning money to Nicaragua, and they're giving money to Nicaragua. At least for the tank buy, they provided $80 million. I don't know exactly how they get the money back because this was, even before Ortega became a full-fledged dictator and a criminal, again, because of what he did in 2018. But, clearly it's not something that they would need. Again, they're thinking in a conflict with Colombia, but even that is something that's ludicrous at this point. And that has been, I think, the Costa Rican critique to many armed forces throughout Latin America always. I mean, what are they for? I mean, why should we have such large armed forces, and not only in Nicaragua, but elsewhere? I mean, the hypothesis of wars in the region, fortunately, have not been significant. But as you well say, a poor country that requires its resources to be put to better use, providing education and health and services to its population, is really something that one would expect will lead to no expenditures or very limited expenditures in military affairs. Now there are also other Nicaragua and Russia have meetings, joint committee meetings every once in a while. They held their last one in 2019. That was the fifth one, and there they laid the ground for these cooperation agreements, which probably in some cases are never paid by Nicaragua or paid by somebody else.
And that's what I'm trying to get to as we go to David. This idea that engagement with what some people have called a criminal regime in Russia, it's not my phrase, but engaging with at least a dictatorship in the context of Russia, obviously imports a lot of corruption and negative practices into the countries that are dealing with them, particularly countries which themselves don't necessarily have strong democratic institutions, et cetera, like Nicaragua. And David, I wonder if you see this pattern repeated elsewhere across Latin America or emerging markets generally. I mean, is Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba sort of a unique circumstance, or is this part of the same playbook that you see elsewhere?
Well, Russia sells or provides, based on a country's financial wherewithal, weapons to different kinds of countries, some that can afford them and others that cannot. And the main purpose, though, is to increase its profile, to elevate its military presence in a region, to get countries to be dependent on Russian supplies, whether they frankly need these weapons or not. And so you look at Venezuela, for example, where Russia has also been providing support. Venezuela doesn't really have money to pay Russia for the things that Russia provides for it. And we see this in other places as well, in Africa and elsewhere, where Russia's goal is to create a position for itself hoping that in the future, these countries will be better off financially in a position to pay Russia back, if you will. Russia does these things both for corrupt personal financial interests, but also to increase its leverage and influence in certain parts of the world. You, I think, are right, Eric, in using the word criminal to describe the Putin regime. I would actually say it's getting close to being a terrorist regime. There are calls on Capitol Hill to designate Putin as a state sponsor of terror. And all this, I think, will raise a discomfort level with the countries in Latin America in terms of their relationship with Moscow. The sanctions that have been imposed by the international community will significantly limit Russia's ability to throw its rubles or dollars, whatever currency they would use, around in various places. It's often been cited that Russia has $630 billion in foreign currency reserves. Well, a large chunk of that is actually not held physically in Russia. And so Russia will have difficulty accessing these funds in order to spread it around to various parts of the world, including in Latin America. We've seen the ruble plummet in value just in the 24, 48 hours after sanctions were imposed on the central bank. We've seen interest rates more than double. So Russia's financial ability to flex its muscles, I think, will be significantly limited, particularly with a region fairly far afield from Russia, meaning Latin America. And yet Putin likes to project power. He wants to assert Russia as a global player. And as long as that is the case, he will look for ways to do so. And so I think we do have to be prepared for some surprises because Putin will look to deflect attention and try to get us preoccupied with problems closer to home than those that are unfolding in Ukraine right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's like the magician, sorry, look over here while I do something over here.
Precisely.
And yeah, I think that's a really important point. Doug, you've done a lot of really important work, groundbreaking work, if I can say, on criminal networks and connections between, bad actors. Let's use that phrase. Give us a sense of how Russia's engagement in Latin America has been leading to an enhancement of the power, the strength, the effectiveness of criminal networks, whether it be drug traffickers, cyber criminals, you name it. You can use whatever, sector of the crime world you want to, but presumably this is not good for democracy, right?
No, clearly it's not good for democracy. And I think one of the key points is that they specifically enable the most repressive regimes in the region. And I think one of the things that one has to understand, and it happened in Nicaragua, it's happened in Venezuela, it's happened in Bolivia, and that is where the Russians provide specific intelligence capabilities and electronic interception capabilities to regimes that then allow them to target the dissidents internally in ways that they have not been able to do before. For example, in 2018, when the protests were starting in Managua, everyone was using WhatsApp because it was assumed to be safe. And you had student activists. Nobody knew, nobody was thinking about security. Russia gave the Ortega regime the capacity to crack WhatsApp, which is why they could track the student leaders so effectively, so quickly, and kill them and jail them. So those are the direct consequences of the types of technology that Russia is importing into the region for the most repressive regimes. I think that the intelligence element of that is not a particularly expensive operation for them. It's not huge, millions and millions of dollars. It's discreet. When you saw in Nicaragua again, when they did the Menchikov vaccination plant that they were going to build there. I don't know if you follow this $20 million plant run by Laureano Ortega. They brought in all the equipment from Costa Rica, pretended it was this thing when they brought the press in, all the machines were there, and the next day they flew them back. And we have no idea what's actually been going on in that factory since then, but we know that they have not made any vaccinations. They have this capacity to project them, and that was an entirely Russian project. So I think that what we see across the region is the ability to strengthen the worst elements, the most anti-democratic elements, deliberately so. And what the president was saying earlier, I think that RT, TV, and those things are not hugely important in much of the region, but surprisingly, RT-TV is very, very powerful in Chile, Argentina, and the Southern Cone. People watch it all the time. It's one of the most preferred mediums of news consumption. So in Central America, they have not made much of a dent. Xinhua, the Chinese side, virtually nothing, although they're just as slickly produced. RT has found a very strong niche which allows it to participate in these other disinformation campaigns. And we had talked, we coined the phrase a while back in the paper we did, the Bolivarian joint criminal enterprise, to describe Venezuela, Bolivia at the time, Ecuador, Nicaragua, because it's a series of states that embrace transnational organized crime as an instrument of state policy, which is what Russia does. And we see over the last few years a significant and documentable rise in state-sponsored Russian organized crime, particularly the cocaine that was found in the Russian embassy in Argentina. Usually those shipments were leaving from Uruguay. These are going from the embassies of Russia in the Southern Cone for sale abroad, and multiple other schemes that we've been monitoring is how they directly impact criminal groups. So I think when you have a state like Russia that embraces transnational organized crime, we can't really carry out organized crime without being tied to the state in some way. With other states in the region that also embrace transnational organized crime, as does Venezuela with the ex-FARC groups and the cocaine trafficking, the illicit gold flows, etc., you have kind of a perfect marriage, right? You have an external partner and regional partners that allow you to do multiple things, all of which are designed at the end, one, to displace the United States, and two, to crush democracy and the rule of law.
I have to ask a follow-up question. Dave, I see you want to jump in, but I just have to ask a follow-up question. What makes Argentina and Chile particularly interested in RT and the other parts of the world not? Have you would you speculate on that?
I don't know. I think because they're very slickly produced and you have, largely knowledgeable consuming audiences, because as the Mr. President said, you have this very slickly produced, very intelligent groups of people. And the other thing is they're really, really quick. Even, like CNN and groups seem like they're laggards in response to what RT can get up in very slickly produced time. So I don't know. It's something that we've been able to document that is there in terms of audience and stuff, but I don't have a good explanation for that.
That's interesting. That's fascinating. David, to you.
Just 2 points, if I could build on what Doug just said. One is about the Sputnik vaccine. The Russians have clearly been trying to use this as part of its vaccine diplomacy. It was the first one developed, and they have been out the gate showing how ready they are to provide it to other countries as part of their generosity in helping with public health challenges elsewhere. The problem with that is the vaccination rate in Russia is incredibly low. Why? Because most Russians don't trust the vaccine. Why is that? Because RT in particular has been undermining the credibility of Western manufactured vaccines. And so Russians hear about that and they wonder, well, are ours any better? We don't think so. So I would offer some caution to any potential users of the Russian vaccine in Latin America. Be careful what you ask for. On the point about corruption and criminality, I think Doug's point and the research he's done on this has been phenomenal. Putin's greatest export is corruption. And in order to export it, however, we import it. We in the West, we in Latin America, wherever we are. And so I think you will see an effort by the international community to crack down on Russian corruption. There's already going to be a formation of a task force between the United States and the European Union to go after oligarchs' money and property and assets, yachts, and so on. I do think that we will see an effort to close off as much as possible Russian corruption that really does damage to our financial systems, our real estate markets, our banking systems, everything. And the other part I would just add is keep an eye out for the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group is a very dangerous mercenary outfit that has been particularly active in the neighborhood where Russia is, but also in the Middle East, in Africa, and I fear increasingly in Latin America too. It's run by a very close ally of Putin's who has been sanctioned by the international community, but it is a very dangerous force that is out to make money and shows no mercy to people who might cross it.
And elements of the Wagner Group have been identified through the years anyway in Venezuela and perhaps elsewhere too. So that's a very potent reminder. Thank you for that and the clarification. Let me build on that, Mr. President. Corruption, or more accurately, the fight against corruption, has been and is a real priority of the Biden administration in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Central America. But corruption is really the top priority. And I wonder, based on what David was just saying, and based on what we've just been talking about in terms of how Latin America has positioned itself with reference to Ukraine and Russia and all of these things, this isn't a fair question to ask you to speak on behalf of Latin America. I understand that, right? And you have a certain perspective, and Costa Rica is thankfully one of the least corrupt countries in the entire world, probably, but certainly Latin America. The question being, though, would you anticipate that Latin America and the Caribbean, because there's a lot of important money centers in the Caribbean, would be partners in this fight, or would they somehow not be fully committed to working with the international community to try to get at some of these illicit assets and try to go after some of the corruption that David and Douglas have been talking about?
Well, I would think that corruption being such a negative influence on all the countries and having such a dire cost for countries, most of the Latin American and Caribbean nations are going to engage in fighting corruption somehow. Now, the problem is that it's not an easy fight, even if there's political will, simply because of the very dynamics of organized crime. It's like any other good business in terms of how it innovates, how it's able to take over institutions. We've seen that as Latin American democratic organizations languish, like for example, local governments, the international criminal organizations take over territory, and then they do almost whatever they please. We have seen this same phenomenon in certain Latin American countries, not as much the southern cone, but certainly Central America, where even presidents have been linked with organizations of criminals. And so this is something that I think the optics of how to handle corruption needs to be first and foremost put inside each country and look at the local networks that have been created by locals, not necessarily by foreigners. I don't think we should be always looking away from our own responsibilities in terms of how corruption has grown to be a larger issue. But clearly, this is something that corruption, that is something that will probably continue to develop. And there's one thing that I find important to highlight. The more pressure the United States puts in these rogue governments or authoritarian governments or even corrupt governments, if that is the case, the more likely it is for them to seek in Russia and other malign actors, say, support or presence in their own borders. So, and it's not only going to be Russia. We are already seeing Bukele, for example, going to Turkey or to the United Arab Emirates or whatever. Not necessarily dictatorial governments. But governments that have issues with the United States, and this may complicate the dialogue, which is already uh, difficult between the United States and the Americas in general. I mean, this is not a good time. I hope that the next summit of the Americas would help make this dialogue to be more fluid. But in the current moment, those other factors are there, not only distracting the United States, but can also have the impact we do not desire in terms of criminal and corrupt activities.
Yeah, these are extraordinarily complicated issues, no doubt, no doubt. If there was an easy solution, it would have been implemented already. And I think that's an important corrective that you just mentioned. Let me jump the queue just a little bit to Doug. President Solis mentioned El Salvador, and I think it was you, but one of you anyway, in earlier comments mentioned El Salvador's abstention at the UN. Also, we know El Salvador is a dollar-based economy, as well as the first country anywhere
Bitcoins,
to
yeah.
use Bitcoin as circulating currency. Do you have any thoughts in terms of, I mean, how do all of these pieces fit together? Is it pure coincidence? Is there something more going on there? Council of the Americas just did a major panel discussion a couple weeks ago, actually at the end of January, on Bitcoin. And, what are some things that people need to know? And El Salvador kept coming up, and so did the word crime. Not to say that El Salvador is engaged in that, but simply that these are issues. How should we think about those?
Well, I think there's no coincidence in this. I think Bukele has tried very hard to uncouple himself from the United States, which is very difficult for a country like El Salvador, partly because of the Biden administration's focus on anti-corruption, and former Ambassador Mains's outspokenness on those issues and things, which really annoyed him personally. But I think there's no rational reason for what El Salvador is doing in Bitcoin and through Chivo Wallet, which is the government-sponsored wallet to hold the Bitcoin, other than to allow massive amounts of money to flow through in an unregulated fashion. I think that one can look at Chivo Wallet and the experiment, not Bitcoin per se, but the experiment, the way it's being run. And what was fascinating in El Salvador was that Ambassador Mains and others actually brought in solid, really smart crypto people to help Bukele set up a system, because the idea was let's do something right, and they were going to do it for free, and he told them, he sent them all away. He wanted to do it his own way in a system that was notably a failure in its launching and other things. So I think that there's multiple reasons to suspect it was not intended to be a transparent system. I think the other thing that we have to keep our eye on, and it goes back to what former President Solis was just saying, and that is on the sanctions front, you have three countries, El Salvador, Panama, and Ecuador, that are dollarized and whose economies are directly linked into the SWIFT system and elsewhere. And I would bet a lot of money that Russia is going to be finding ways to work into those financial systems. And I think that Bukele's abstention is a bet that he can make a better deal than he can get from the United States. Elsewhere, I think in this case it's a rather preposterous bet, but through Russia and the way to bring other resources into his cash-starved and deficit-ridden economy at this moment, and Bitcoin, I think, will be a part of that for him, or at least a part of his calculation. But I think we need to keep a real eye on Ecuador, not because they're unfriendly or they want to do it, but their system is not built to withstand a lot of penetration efforts by illicit economies. And the final thing I'd say is that we've seen in sanctions around the world, we've seen Venezuela and Nicaragua particularly use Russia to evade sanctions. I think Russia will do the same thing now. They're looking for ways to move their money out in ways that will, through allies, through ways that can get them back into the financial system. It'll be very costly. They're not going to move huge amounts. It's not going to be like a massive success. But all these little cracks and rivulets that we've seen that have allowed the Maduro regime to survive, the Ortega regime to survive, the Cuban regime to survive, will be put to full use by the Russians as well.
Yeah, these are really important points. I want to build on that conversation. SWIFT is basically the nuclear bomb in the financial world. And David Kramer, the senior director at the National Security Council, Juan Gonzalez, just recently told the Voice of America, and let me read a direct quote, that the sanctions that are being put on Russia right now because of Ukraine, and this is a quote, will have an impact on those countries that have economic affiliations with Russia, and that is by design, unquote. So it goes to the point that Doug is making about countries with a direct economic and financial relationship with Russia. But let me ask you for your views on that. How badly do you think, whether by design for some countries or perhaps broader impact on other countries, how badly do you think Latin America is going to get hit by sanctions which are aimed at Russia but have a broader impact?
Well, I think there are a few components to this. One is, so far at least, the Chinese have not indicated that they are prepared to break sanctions for Russia. And that will be critical because I think Putin was hoping and depending on President Xi to be the alternative, that they would set up this alternative currency and reduce Russia's dependency. And if the Chinese don't do that, and my understanding is that the United States has been talking extensively with the Chinese about this, then Putin is going to lose a major lifeline, if you will. I don't think he can compensate for that with any countries or a combination of countries in Latin America. And then Latin American countries, along with any other country that's doing business with Russia, or any companies or any individuals for that matter, will have a choice to make. Do they want to violate sanctions that have been imposed, not just by the United States, but by the European Union and others, including the expulsion of Russia from SWIFT? Or do they want to do business with Russia? And so I think most countries will come down on the side of staying in the good graces of the United States, particularly those that depend on the dollar for their currency. it would be very costly and possibly very painful for any countries to try to defy these sanctions. These are the swiftest, no pun intended, and most powerful sanctions that have been imposed on any country in history. They are unprecedented, and they are having an immediate impact. There have been runs on Russian ATMs and banks. Putin imposed a limit on the amount of foreign currency that Russians can take out on $10,000 limit. And just today, he had and his authorities have been cracking down on Russians who are trying to flee the country. So we see an increasingly desperate situation in Russia. I think the sanctions, to be honest, are almost having a faster impact than perhaps the Western community that has imposed them anticipated. And so Latin American countries are going to have to race to keep up with this and stay in good standing.
May I, Eric, ask David, because he told me this when we were preparing the article for the Miami Herald about more Russians migrating into the United States from the South. And I think that's another piece. Do you think this is going to, can you tell us about that? And also note if this, do you think this is going to increase, David?
I expect, President Solis, that we will see an exodus of Russians if they are able to leave. There was one report today, for example, of a plane that was flying to Istanbul that was forced to turn around and land in the North Caucasus part of Russia. The flights, those that are available anyway, and a lot of flights have been canceled. Western airlines are not flying into Moscow anymore because of the sanctions. But Russian airlines and trains, all of these things are overbooked. And so people are scrambling to get out. And this has accelerated just today alone because of the concerns that martial law will increase. So for those who are able to get out, I think the most immediate impact will be on the neighboring states. Ukraine had been a country where a lot of Russians had fled, those who were basically forced out of the country. That, of course, now is not a possibility. Georgia has been another one. The Baltic states were also destinations. But I think, yes, those who are able to get across the Atlantic might in fact try to get into the United States through Mexico. And so I think it is possible that we will see an increase. Sorry to go on, but just very quickly, we're going to see a refugee crisis. We already are. More than 1 million Ukrainians have fled the country. The UN has estimated up to 10 million Ukrainians displaced. Some 4 to 5 million of those will become refugees. Poland has really stepped up in taking in Ukrainians, but this is going to be a global responsibility. And I think those countries that can need to open their doors to people who have to flee. Sorry.
No, that's a really important point. And I mean, look, Latin America is no stranger to migration flows for sure. We know how disruptive and frankly, I mean, these are human lives that are at stake, and it's a tragic situation. I mean, we can't emphasize that enough. Speaking of knock-on effects in terms of sanctions and impact on the Western Hemisphere, let's move beyond the strictly financial sanctions. Mr. President, if I can ask you to put your hat on again as a former president of a country in Latin America that basically imports most of what it requires, whether energy or foodstuffs or what have you. Look, we see Brent crude going over almost $100 a barrel for the first time since 2008. Venezuela likes that, but many people who are importing don't. We see commodities indexes increasing historically rapidly. Wheat, which of course Russia and Ukraine are major exporters, fertilizer, everything else. This is really going to hurt countries in the region that have to import. Inflation goes up. How do you manage that as a politician to make sure that the impact of a European war is not unduly imported into your own country and therefore have negative political knock-on effects? And then I want to ask essentially the same question both to David and Doug, but in the context of upcoming elections this year in Colombia and Brazil, two major countries, allies of the United States, where Russian, at least media activities have been prominent, and to get views in terms of how that might play out. But as a former president, how would you be viewing this to make sure that, frankly, your own political fortunes aren't unduly and unnecessarily impacted by sanctions on Russia?
Well, with a lot of concern, but truly, the problem had begun before. I mean, we're seeing interest rates going up in the United States. We're seeing inflation also that because of the nature of our economies and how they're interwoven with the United States economy, we're already putting a lot of pressure on our own economy, or we're expected to put a lot of pressure on our own economy. I mean, and on the average, 50% of all exports and imports come and go from Central America back to the United States and from the United States. So, this is something that was already complicated. Now it's going to be even more so. I thought that I had read somewhere that the Brent barrel of petroleum was over $114 already. So, that for a country that has a very significant fleet that operates solely on petroleum that's imported puts a lot of strain into the economy. And it generates a problem also for a lot of American enterprises that are lodged in Costa Rica as part of our industries producing sophisticated medical hardware. So I think that the new government, there's going to be a new government in May. We are about to celebrate our second round of our elections. And I think that whoever is elected will have to inherit this big problem. And the thing is, we're also very dependent on tourism. So whatever happens goes well beyond Russia, the Russia scenario, the theater of operations, and comes directly into our living rooms. I mean, here we have a situation that was already complicated. It had worsened with the pandemic. We were almost out of that, and now we have, this other accumulated circumstance that drops on top of the economy. So, as a former president, I have to say that this is a matter of grave concern. We don't know when it's going to end, and when and where it's going to end. So, whatever outlooks we may have to prepare ourselves are probably not going to be useful anyway, because we cannot plan for the uncertain. And the world we have entered after the invasion of Ukraine is very uncertain. I think that's probably the best word to describe it. And therefore, for Latin America, this is going to be a significant issue. And it's going to affect everybody, even those countries that have been able to recuperate after the pandemic faster than others.
Yeah, the situation wasn't great even before the invasion, and you're exactly right. And Federal Reserve is going to raise interest rates beginning this month, and that was already going to impact the region. Other central banks in the region have already raised interest rates, etc. So you're quite right. This is not what the region needs, in my personal view, in any way. Although obviously the main impact is Ukraine, but Latin America doesn't need this problem either. Let me build on that then just a little bit. Doug, you have eloquently written and spoken actually with the Council of the Americas and elsewhere before about the public protests and crises around particularly South America in 2019, in Chile and Peru and Colombia and Ecuador, Brazil. Am I missing any? But certainly around the region. I don't have access to any intelligence or anything like this, but the speculation and some of the open source comments that maybe some of this was amplified by bots coming out of Russia that might be affiliated with the Kremlin or the at least media environment and all that. All that aside, let's look to the future. We got some important elections coming up: Costa Rica, Colombia, Brazil, others. Where do you see Russia trying to engage, if at all, on some of these things? I mean, presumably it would be a meaningful win strategically for Russia to have a certain candidate elected in one or both of those major countries in South America, no?
Well, I think that what we saw in 2019 is past speculation. We know that the Russians, particularly operating out of Nicaragua, flooded the areas in terms of where there was legitimate protests. I don't think in any of the countries the protests were manufactured or driven by this, but we saw the amount of tweets and misinformation flowing into those countries amplified and blew it up. Like, for example, in Chile, there've been a lot of social protests through the years. Suddenly they're burning 50 metro stations. Why? Because there's small cadres of people who were sent in to do that and blow it out further and amplify specific messages. So I don't think in any way you want to, I don't want to delegitimize the social protests, but there were these factors that came in. And I think the big question is, whether Russia can keep that up or not. Do they have the bandwidth now going into these elections in Latin America to pay attention? If you read, Valery Gerasimov and others in the Russian, looking at the doctrine of how they want to operate outside, the cyber warfare and the public information war space is equal to the military war space. I don't think that they can. I don't know if they can keep that up. If they can keep up this level of effort, and it's built in Nicaragua, it's built in Venezuela, it's built in Cuba, so it's probably not a huge lift economically to maintain what they're doing. But I think you're going to see efforts of significant impacts, particularly in Colombia, which would be the crown jewel. If you could get a government in Colombia that was willing to begin to decouple from the United States in significant ways, it would certainly help Venezuela, their primary client state there. It would certainly help Cuba, and it would certainly help the armed groups that are supporting those regimes, the FARC dissidents and those groups. So I think that I think that we don't know yet what the capacity is, but if they can maintain this capacity, they're not at all afraid to play in those spheres. And that's not something they're going to say, oh, should we meddle or not? No, they're meddling, and they want to meddle, and they'll continue to meddle. The question is internally, how do you combat that? We didn't do such a great job in our own electoral cycle, so it's not like it's an easy thing to do. And I think that it would be, I would imagine, and others who know Russia better than me would certainly know about this more, but it seems to me that they would like to keep their allies in place and this is a low-cost effort to do that. So I think we will see Russian meddling in the region significantly.
Well, David, I think that's a perfect segue to you. And it looks like we only have a couple minutes remaining, so let's give you the final word in this particular session. Based on what Doug was just saying, how do you see this? Is this a space that you anticipate Russia continuing to play in, amplifying or decreasing, focusing on something else, maybe using different tools, or just help us think through what the future looks like a little bit?
I do, Eric, and I agree with Doug. I think that this for Putin is a prime target of opportunity where he thinks he can even the score with the United States. And so I do think they will. The question will be, and I think Doug was getting at this, the means by which they will be able to accomplish this. Hybrid is less expensive. We're not talking so much about kinetic, but when it comes to propaganda through RT, Sputnik, that's relatively easy to do, although they have been pumping in hundreds of millions of dollars into their effort on this, and it will take some to keep that going. They are going to be in a severe crunch, and and I underscore the word if, martial law is declared tomorrow, that would suggest that Putin is not so comfortable with the situation at home that he feels he needs to crack down. For all intents and purposes, Russia has kind of been under martial law for the past several years, but to make it official and formal, if he declares it tomorrow, would indicate that he is a little nervous about what might happen in Russia. We have seen very brave and heroic Russians turning out to protest Putin's unprovoked war against Ukraine, and they do so despite the risk of arrest, getting beaten up. And if more people turn out as they start feeling the pain, and the pain is already hitting many Russians, Putin is going to have to pay more attention to what's happening at home. I guess I would end by saying, with the old expression, these regimes seem stable until they're not. And we never quite know what the tipping point for these regimes may be. It is possible, I don't want to engage in wishful thinking, but it is possible Mr. Putin has made a major mistake here, and we'll have to see what happens. And Eric, let me just say, as sort of the outsider, the person who doesn't know Latin America but follows Russia, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with three true experts. And so it's been very informative and educational for me. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, indeed, what a great way to conclude our activity together. And I would simply second what Dave Kramer just said to all of us, all of you, for a fascinating conversation. Fascinating. Our time is at an end, regrettably, but I hope that each one of you at some point will come back and help us further develop these conversations. There's so much more here, and as President Solis was saying, the word of the day is uncertainty. I would even say volatility. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, maybe martial law, maybe not, but at the end of the day, this will have impacts across the Western Hemisphere, not the least of which will, of course, be the United States and Canada. So we'll be watching these issues very, very carefully. Ladies and gentlemen, this will conclude our program today with the Council of the Americas. We hope that you will come back very soon. We have a lot of very interesting and even exciting activities coming up. So watch our website, watch your emails, and we really look forward to seeing you again very soon. In the meantime, would you please join me virtually in thanking our 3 experts for their expertise, their time, and their friendship today. We look forward to seeing all of them again very soon. This will conclude our program. This is Eric Farnsworth in Washington. Thank you very much and have a great day.